Thank you very much, Raymond. And Raymond has a few publications at the front as well, which are also for sale. Our first speaker this afternoon is Dr. Jennifer Orr, who's a senior lecturer at Newcastle University. Her book on the Ulster Raymond Weavers, focusing on Samuel Thompson's network in County Antrim, is a must-read if you're interested in the subject matter that we're talking about today. If any interest in the Enlightenment, I really cannot recommend that book highly enough. Her current project is called Transatlantic Networks, 1800 to 1845, which is building a who's who of the romantic transatlantic world. We're very lucky to have her here today talking about David Bailie Warden. So without further ado, Jenny, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming to hear all of the papers today. And James, thank you. I really appreciate you inviting me to come over to speak. I'm not going home tomorrow as I planned because of the weather, so it was obviously meant to be that I'm staying for a little bit longer. But James has asked us to each briefly talk a little bit about our own educational background as a beginning, and I'm rather sheepishly admitting that I am a product of a single-sex grammar school in North Down. You can guess which one. But overall, my experience was fairly positive. But I have to say, what I didn't like was being addressed by the school management as ladies. I always found that bristled me somewhat. All very Swiss finishing school. However, we did have quite a good curriculum, quite an exciting and radical curriculum in many ways, due to, I think, the wonderful humanities teachers that we had, particularly the historians, one of whom I'd love to pay tribute today. She's no longer with us, Anne Irwin, who was a great civil rights campaigner in her day, and just in every sense a real character who wasn't afraid to be provocative and anti-authoritarian, and I think that served us all quite well. But one experience that stands out, because I think it has funneled into everything that I've kind of done since, and that was Maureen Aiken, who we lost sadly last year, who decided to teach as an optional AS level history module the United Irishman. And she was one of the first to take that on in that kind of post-1998 period of, I suppose, hopeful atmosphere of a shared history, and also coming out as well of the bicentenary of the United Irishman in 1998, when there was so much great scholarship coming to the fore about this area of history. And of course, my dad's not able to be here today, but he would love me to mention that, of course, remember Orr was the great mantra of the United Irishman, and that was a part of our history that we had to recover some time later. It was not something that was talked about at the time because of the shame of being involved with the rebellion. But anyway, something has stuck, and I'm still going to be talking about a United Irishman here today, David Bailie Warden. And I'm very pleased that my colleague Frank is here today, who's an expert also on this area. We're very, very pleased that so many students come to this with a fresh and open mind, seeing it as romantic poetry, working class poetry, writing about real people's experience, and that's happening in England, it's happening here in Ulster, and it's happening across in America as well. So this does have quite a considerable reach, even if Oxford University Press doesn't want to publish anything on it. So we still face an uphill struggle of non-canonical work. But I'm going to talk about a little bit about United Irishmen, a little bit about education as well, to introduce David Bailie Warden, a case study in my current research project. And it touches on the often hidden history of the Scottish Enlightenment in that emigration experience across the Atlantic. And I'd like to think broadly about what happens if we step outside the contemporary legacy of politics, 20th and 21st century, and take a historical frame. So how might a historical model of cosmopolitanism spearhead different conversations about Irish or Northern Irish identity? So as a background to this paper, I'm currently leading this project at Newcastle University called Transatlantic Networks. And it's a series of historical letter collections that we are transcribing by hand, drawn from archives across America and Europe. And we're aiming really to build a picture of what transatlantic social and intellectual networks looked like in the 19th century and how they connected. And our starting point is the large archive of correspondence held by David Bailie Warden, a native of Grey Abbey, County Down, who became one of the most well-connected people of his age. So it was quite a feat in this period. An exiled United Irish Republican, Warden began his international career in the United States in exile, and one of the summer soldiers of the 1798 Rising. In 1808, he reappeared in the public sphere as American consul for Paris, serving James Madison's administration while keeping a scholarly sideline in translation, geography, and also collaboration with a number of the Paris savants, figures like Henri Gregoire, Georges Cuvier, Alexander von Humboldt, so quite a few scientists. But by 1830, this long-term resident of Paris, France, was recognised as one of the most respected and well-connected polymaths in the transatlantic world. Warden attracted many English-speaking visitors who hoped to benefit from his connections with most of the learned societies in France and America. In fact, I would say he has claims to be one of the main bridges between learned societies in the United States and in France. He was a member of the National Institute of France, or l'Institut National, and the American Philosophical Society at Philadelphia. And significantly, and in contrast to a number of dominant narratives about Irish political activity in early America, his contributions to American culture and to its institutions took place at a geographical distance from it, so mostly from Paris. And the evidence of his contributions are captured in an extraordinary network of correspondence, which includes among its ranks some of the most prominent literary, scientific, and political figures of the day, down to the virtually unknown. I'm sorry the writing is very tiny, but that's really just to give you an idea of how many people he was in touch with, and those are only the major ones. So the project itself aims to map a network. And how do we do that? It's using digital humanities. And by the end, I will hopefully have transcribed 7,000 individual letters that passed through his hands. And using the software language called XML markup, we will highlight different entities within those letters, things like places, dates, names, publications. And it has a number of aims. One is to simply make these letters publicly available, searchable, for anybody to use. Secondly, to link to biographical material, so bringing all of these people into better known, if you like. And thirdly, the markup, the metadata of the project can be used to create visual maps. So displaying who is writing to whom across time, and to get a better sense of the fabric of social networks in this period. So there's a lot of focus in history on the big names, your Lafayettes, Jeffersons, etc. But there are a lot of lesser-known individuals, like Warden himself, who are really holding these networks together. And this is important because it is these individual people, these small, invisible individuals, who keep the networks going against some really trying historical circumstances. The period 1800 to 1845 saw a global revolution, North and South America, Europe, the Caribbean, decades of transatlantic war between France, Britain and America, and of course multiple changes of systems of government, monarchy to republic and back again several times. So whilst resident in Paris, Warden sees no less than 3 republics declared and 2 restorations of the Bourbon monarchy. So sometimes this work that he's doing happens because of his migrant status. The fact that he can go under the radar, mix with different groups of people, sometimes secret networks with former Republicans, etc. And those multiple identities allows him to move kind of seamlessly in that way. But as we know, sometimes multiple identities puts you in a rather awkward position in relation to the state. So we'll talk about that as well. So why are these people invisible in history? Well, as I've mentioned, historical figures are often classified by national significance. That is starting to change a little bit. But ironically, the very transnationalism that made Warden such an effective networker has often made it difficult for historians to understand how to place him. And that's something that I think, the Ulster poets have also experienced, being between Scottish, Irish identities and so on. Warden was, after all, an Irish patriot who participated in armed struggle on behalf of the country. He was also an Ulster Scot by birth and education, born into a Presbyterian farming family in County Down and educated at the University of Glasgow. He was also a self-proclaimed American citizen and a passionate American expat in France, where he chose to spend the rest of his life, and for a time even represented the American government officially as consul for Paris from 1808 to 1814. Like every good Ulsterman, he was a bit tetchy, got himself sacked from government in 1814. Nevertheless, he continued on throughout his life to represent American cultural interests, speaking on behalf of the country, producing scholarship, welcoming its visitors, particularly young American intellectuals. And I've included this slide because this shows the number of letters of introduction that were written to Warden between the years of 1817 and 1831. So you have prominent Americans back home writing on behalf of their students, their family members, because they had been taken care of themselves in Paris by Warden. They then recommend their own protégés to him as a second generation. And so this is an indicator of this guy's multi-generational importance as a connective figure. And his decision to promote American values abroad resulted from a commitment to values of cosmopolitanism, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more later, the Enlightenment idea of being a citizen of the world, refracted through a belief that the Republican government system of America was the best model. In spite of this evidence that he was the go-to American in Paris, the American newspapers paid little attention to his death in 1845, and this may be in part due to the large changes in the makeup of his network, and particularly the fact that he survived many of his United Irish contemporaries. So figures like William Sampson, Thomas Addis Emmet, William Sinclair all predeceased him. But ironically, it was within Britain, the empire against which he had rebelled, that his achievements were noted posthumously. His fellow scientists, in a meeting of the Royal Society in London, paid tribute to him. And subsequently, an extensive tribute published in the Belfast Northern Whig not only eulogised him as the only American of any significance among the men of science in Paris, but claimed Warden for the Irish Patriot cause. And this speaks to the softening political climate, or the softening historical climate of the 1840s, where the reputation of the United Irishman was being celebrated by individuals such as Richard Robert Madden, who wrote United Irishmen, Their Lives and Times, and he was interviewing the survivors of the 98, figures like James Hope, Mary Ann McCracken, and they were becoming sought-after primary sources for historians. So the obvious question is that Warden's public profession of American identity might seem somewhat at odds with this position in Irish patriot history. Yet his private correspondence evinces lifelong connections with friends and associates here in Ireland, not least Samuel Martin Stevenson, the founder of the Belfast Dispensary and Academical Institution, through whom Warden supplied the Belfast Literary Societies with European journals and books. And he also remained in contact with local Grey Abbey neighbours, not least the Reverend Hewitson, who had pleaded on his behalf in 1798, and as historian Guy Biner has noted, Warden's lifelong admiration of one of the first martyrs of the United Irishmen, the Reverend James Porter of Grey Abbey. This is marked in the fact that Warden kept his whole life the notebook of Porter's astronomical lectures. And he then sends this on to Alexander Porter, the surviving son of James Porter in Louisiana, where he was a Supreme Court justice. And finally, he was commemorated by one of the most radical United Irishmen in France, Miles Byrne. He had served as an agent to the French government and described Warden as one of the true Irish patriots of 1798. And these memoirs record him as an active member of the Irish exile community in Paris, where he was using his American diplomatic role to, I suppose, support United Irish exiles, particularly the likes of Matilda Tone, who was living with support of Napoleon at that point. But other than the tomes, there's very little evidence of him actually writing to these guys in Paris. And that suggests, I think, that his dealings were either in person or that he was circumspect and he destroyed a lot of that correspondence. So clearly, there is an awareness that public involvement with fellow Irish people in Paris could be injurious to his prospects with the American government. So there are obvious limits here to cosmopolitanism. So why is Warden's Enlightenment descent important for Northern Ireland? Well, I feel he's an important historical figure for us, not only because of the Patriot story or his status as a local boy made good, which we always like, though these stories are remarkable in themselves, but because his unusual position as a self-identifying Republican, American Republican, in France goes against the grain of more well-trodden narratives of emigration from Ulster to America. And whether this is the narrative of the Irish American, built America, for example, or the Ulster Scots assimilation narrative. So he doesn't really fit into either of those things. That being said, although he wouldn't have used those particular labels, both of those avenues of heritage definitely fired his radicalism. His education, his dissenting religion, and his Republican politics were inextricably linked with the Scottish Enlightenment education he received at Glasgow. University gave him a theoretical framework through which to understand his Irish compatriots' lived experiences, particularly injustice. His dissenting Christian faith sharpened his senses of that injustice. And the historian William Thomas Latimer, who wrote in 1907, describes Warden as an ardent patriot who felt strongly for the Irish people in their disabilities and sufferings. This undoubtedly inspired his decision to join the United Irishmen. As the son of a County Down Presbyterian tenant farmer who was forced to pay tithes to a church he didn't attend, he didn't belong to, and he was effectively barred by religious beliefs from higher education in this country. That gave him an awareness of political inferiority, something that dissenters shared at that time with the Catholic majority. While England had its dissenting academies like Moorfields in London and Warrington, which established a healthy radical counterculture, associated as they were with figures like Richard Price, Joseph Priestley, John Aiken, and Anna Barbauld, Ireland's male dissenters had to travel to the likes of Glasgow in order to study. And this was often, as it is today, a great sacrifice that parents would make on behalf of their children to put them through education. And I say this as an Oxford alumni, so don't shoot me. But in contrast to Oxford and Cambridge, which followed a traditional curriculum, the dissenting academies were at the cutting edge of scientific and philosophical debates. And as Joseph Priestley put it here to the Prime Minister, William Pitt, our institutions are more liberal and therefore better calculated to answer the purpose of a truly liberal education. Thus, while your universities resemble pools of stagnant water, ours are rivers, which, taking their natural course, fertilise a whole country. Priestley's powerful dissenting rhetoric, a feature of British public life in the 1780s and 90s, goes some way to explaining why the government might have been so keen to cut off the influence of articulate young graduates like Warden, particularly coming out of the United Irishmen. According to the historian E.R.R. Green, young Warden had not confined himself to his theology, and besides being a licentiate of the Presbyterian Church, he held a colonel's commission in the United Irishmen. But of course, many of us know this is not such a paradox as it might seem. Ian McBride, Andrew Holmes, and a number of historians have detailed the Presbyterian polemical and Scottish Enlightenment theology that often fed political radicalism. This might be obvious in the more liberal New Light tradition, but also in the theologically conservative Old Light Presbyterian or Covenanter tradition, who were acutely aware of any kind of interference in their religious practice, particularly from the monarchy. So, of course, that serves to radicalise them. And at stake was the idea of liberty, if not pure toleration. Dissenting theology was influenced by two key Enlightenment ideas: universalism, So the essential belief that all are equal in the sight of God and therefore in the sight of mankind. And the political theory of contractarianism, the belief expounded by philosophers like John Locke that the relationship between the individual and the authorities forms a social contract. So if the authorities don't deliver on their side of the bargain, you can withdraw. Maybe we should remember that a little bit in today's society. But beyond Ireland's particular political situation, United Irish Dissent tapped into its broader tradition in British radical counterculture. Many dissenters like Priestley here behind me and Anna Barball, in spite of their discomfort with Catholicism, held that intolerance towards other religious practices was a fundamentally anti-Christian position. A wonderfully titled sermon, The Protestant Catholic, published by English radical printer Joseph Johnson, argued for the existence of sinless anger against injustice that was fully justified by circumstance. And the historian Daisy Hay has explained this concept as a touchstone of dissenting politics, the phrase encompassing both the right of self-defence and the responsibility of marginalised patriots to argue and to write their way towards national reformation. And we can see this in an example of Warden's very first publication, a farewell address to the junto of the Synod of Bangor, published in Glasgow as he was sent into exile in 1798. Now, Warden had hoped that in exile he might make a living on the basis of his probationary licence to preach as a Presbyterian minister, but this licence was revoked by the Presbytery of Bangor in a move designed to publicly censure his involvement with the rising. According to Warden, this was done to assuage their own complicity in that rising. He accuses the Presbytery of hypocrisy, highlighting that many of its members had also been implicated or at least expressed their support for Republican politics. He writes, "Every one of you has both publicly and privately circulated Republican morality, that religion is a personal thing, that Christ is the head of the church, that his kingdom is not of this world, that the will of the people should be the supreme law. And now, from terror to show your fatuous glowworm loyalty, you have met a military inquisition, incorporated the mild religion of Jesus with your serpentine cunning. And the present political fermentation superseded the court of equity and court-martial deviated from justice, honour and honesty." This is very much the tone of his writing the whole way through his life. So you can imagine how the American government feel dealing with this young kind of subordinate consul. But when dealing with Ulster and our own Irish history, it's sometimes easy to forget that the politics of the particular exists always in tandem with the broader European political influences. And while Warden's farewell address was targeted at the junto of Bangor, its language articulates a more general Republican ethos built on freedom of thought, expression, religion, individual sovereignty. And all of these qualities for him was embodied in the revolutionary project of America. A statistical, political, and historical account of the United States of North America, it really rolls off the tongue. His publication of 1819 was the publication that made his name. This was translated into 3 languages and really establishes him as the international expert on the American Republic at a time when this emergent nation is in the eyes of the world as the great Republican experiment. A statistical history was framed as a quantitative study of a great nation which has taken its place among the most powerful and enlightened states in the world, constituted on principles to which the old world presents nothing precise. So whilst the old world came up with the ideas of enlightenment, the new world would be where it came to fruition. And that's very much in sympathy with the writings of the likes of Priestley and Barbald and other dissenting writers. But according to Warden, the fruit of America's success was meritocracy, the idea that it offered all of its citizens opportunities. All its offices are open to their ambition, he writes, and neither birth, professions, or any declaration of religious belief is a bar to their hopes. This identification became all the stronger, even throughout his lifelong residence in France. Somewhat remarkable, given that he actually only returns to the United States on 2 occasions in 1810 and 1812. So Warden's belief that he could accurately represent the United States cause through scholarship, especially without living there, proved ultimately to be rather naive. But it throws up all kinds of questions about identity. Can you ever be a truly global citizen? Or at the end of the day, do you have to give your loyalty to a single nation? And which nation will that be? How do migrants square their multiple affiliations to the motherland, the adopted country, or the country in which they reside? And of course, those questions of identity have particular significance for us in Northern Ireland as we try to negotiate that fraught question. And I've put up here Tony Gallagher's recent report into religion and diversity in the education system in Northern Ireland, showing where respondents felt that they sat within a range of national identities on offer. And you can see there's quite a lot to choose from. You might even find yourself falling into multiple categories: British-Irish, British-only, Irish-only, etc. But however much you choose to self-identify, or how those around you recognise you, the state may often make that decision for you. And even our education system, arguably, when children apply to certain schools, the school has ways of making that decision for them. So in spite of living through this age of cosmopolitan universalism, Warden found himself in that kind of debacle. As far as he was concerned, he identified as an American. He was living in France, and he has a Republican background in Ireland. However much he believed that he represented the United States government in France through the many acts of service and scholarship that he performed, however much others recognised him in this capacity, one even calls him the unofficial ambassador of the United States, it was clear that this is not a view shared in Washington, particularly among the more long-established Federalist families who dominate quite a few government jobs. We've already noted that it seemed necessary for Warden to conceal his revolutionary background from most of his American political peers, maintaining perhaps a private correspondence with fellow United Irish exiles. And this reveals some awareness, at least, of the limitations that his American citizenship and his diplomatic role placed upon his cosmopolitan ideals. In contrast to his claims about meritocracy in American public office, Warden did not fully appreciate that subordination, not ambition, was what Washington expected of its diplomats abroad. And this really comes into focus during the succession crisis which followed the unexpected death of Joel Barlow, the minister to France in 1812. Eager to put himself forward to fill Barlow's vacant role and unable to get a response from Washington, Warden applied directly to the French Foreign Ministry to recognise him as Consul General, the official representative of America in France. He achieves recognition by the Duke de Bassano, here on the right, which occasioned an outrage among his fellow consular rivals, particularly Consul William Lee of Bordeaux, who felt he had the right to claim this. So he's drawn into a commercial conflict with Lee and the newly appointed minister, William Crawford, who comes from Washington to find this guy having claimed, to be the Consul General. Crawford rules in Lee's favour. And of course, the same Warden who lambasted the junto of Bangor is the same man who refuses to accept his fate at the hands of the US government. He appeals directly to the people in the same high-minded language, and it doesn't go well. So unfortunately, he misjudges the way that his aggressive and direct Republican tone, something that he saw as very Jeffersonian, clashes with the cultural hierarchies of Madisonian Washington. So 4 years previously, he had been considered a mild-mannered man of few connections but high abilities, and particularly when those abilities exceeded those of the minister himself. But by 1814, his pretensions to high office as a naturalised American made it too easy for his enemies, such as Lee, to suggest that his rebellious Irish past foreshadowed his duplicitous present. Lee writes, "I will confess to your Excellency that as a Native American, it's an interesting usage for a white man, educated in my country, descending from one of the oldest and most respectable families, and with more connections in the United States than perhaps any other man, to be thus calumniated by an adventurer who is obliged to fly from his own country and has not lived long enough in mine to be legally naturalised, is insupportable. Lee's complaint conveys more than a hint of the nativist sentiment that underpinned the official grounds for Warden's dismissal, stated to be a breach of protocol in his appeal for recognition by the French. Now, this charge notably overlooked the fact that consular rivals like Lee had made similar appeals to the foreign government. Warden, nevertheless, continued on by dint of sheer bloody-mindedness, really, until his death in 1845, multiplying his endeavours to represent America abroad, introducing citizens to the cultural powerhouses of Paris, contributing scholarship, and conveying thousands of letters and items across the Atlantic. Warden's unceasing activity in this area was crucial, in the words of Daisy Hay, to the analytical vision of a world without boundaries, in which books and knowledge could pass between countries in an endlessly productive exchange. So, returning to Northern Ireland, the fact is that figures like Warden are feeding Belfast print culture, figures who are coming from all over the international spectrum. And the scholarship that Warden published in Europe and America united common causes among global republicans, not least the crusade against the transatlantic slave trade, a cause in which Belfast was very prominent. While fulfilling his diplomatic duties to the American government, Warden pursued a number of collaborations with French republicans, one of which was a translation in 1810 of the Abbé Grégoire's De la littérature des nègres, which in English translates as The Cultural Achievements of Negroes. This radical work by a French revolutionary challenged much of the contemporary supremacist race theory that had been used to justify the enslavement of African peoples. And this collaboration with Warden, who of course was a dissenting Republican, and Grégoire, a Catholic and French revolutionary, two men who shared an ardent republicanism and faith in democracy, announced Warden to the international scene as more than just a US commercial agent. It allowed him to transform the cultural function of the consul to something more in line with what we would now consider an ambassadorial role. And according to the pioneering scholar of African American culture, Sidney Kaplan, Warden's translation of Grégoire held great importance for the abolitionist movement in the States. The dedication to the English translation paid tribute to all those men who have had the courage to plead the cause of the unhappy blacks, whether in their writings or by speeches in national assemblies, in order to relieve the sufferings of the slaves and to free them. Though his work was translated in Paris for an American audience, Warden's efforts were, of course, in tandem with the United Irishmen's own abolitionist activities in Ireland. And it's well known, I'm sure, by most of you that in the 1790s, Radical Belfast offered a platform to the anti-slavery movement alongside its own Republican cause. In 1791, the leading United Irishman Samuel Neilson, editor of the Northern Star newspaper, welcomed the formerly enslaved writer Olado Equiano, following the fourth edition of Equiano's interesting narrative published in Dublin and Belfast. So Equiano testified to the fact that one of the warmest welcomes he received was here in Belfast. Likewise, the marvellous Marianne McCracken, I'm delighted to see enshrined here, an associate of the United Irish Movement and of course an abolitionist and philanthropist in her own right, continued to promote the abolitionist movement right into her 90s. And reclaim the Enlightenment, particularly John, who's over here on the right, have really played no small part in making that happen and getting her the recognition that she deserves as a pioneer in her own right. And I hope that, similar recognition will happen for figures like Warden. It's crucial for our children to learn not only of the role of the Enlightenment in Belfast culture, but the human rights advances that were championed on this soil. This mass public discourse, coupled with a homegrown print culture, with all of its international influences, really fed what a number of us believe is a romantic movement that happened here on Ulster soil. And so what can this kind of history teach us? I think there are important questions that we can ask ourselves about the international connections of a historical figure and how that spearheads different conversations about identity. To me, one of the interesting things about Warden's story is how he does that migration narrative in reverse. He defies stereotypes of the Irishman who goes to America and his determination to self-identify as a cosmopolitan Republican wherever he happened to be in the world. And this flew in the face of an American establishment which, though it professed to be the land of the universal rights of mankind, rejected his kind of immigrant. And even his fellow United Irish emigrants really struggled to understand why he didn't return to the United States. But so much of Warden's unlikely survival against the odds can be attributed to his own education, which both fired his radical political philosophy and established credentials which allowed him to then rehabilitate himself abroad in exile. His life and work evidences the often neglected story of the Scottish Enlightenment on the development of American culture and values, particularly that cosmopolitan Republican vision that transcends the local and national politics. So how might transnational, arguably trans-sectarian figures like Warden help us to re-examine our shared history and culture? Well, they remind us that our identities have never been fixed. They're complex, they're pluralist and non-binary. They are shaped by migration, whether forced or by choice, and challenge the dominant narratives about our emigration stories and our contribution to the world, whether it's the Republican Irish built America or the Scots-Irish assimilation narrative. Warden's steadfast belief in cosmopolitanism was clearly challenged in his own lifetime, but when we consider the looming threat of global warfare, anti-immigration sentiment, etc., perhaps these values have never been more under threat. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks a million, Jennifer. It was brilliant. Anybody who works in university, haven't heard a description of stagnant pool of water, would not know whether to laugh or cry. All right. So we have a couple of minutes for questions, so I'll throw it open to the floor.
If he didn't live that long in America and he's concentrated in France, it seems to be he's selling the ideal of America rather than maybe the reality of America.
Very much so.
Kind of like this kind of romantic notion that he's trying to sell. And I'm also kind of curious, where does he get his money from, his finances? Does he get his salary?
Yeah. It's a very good question. He loses most of that money, by the way, lending it to Helen Maria Williams and various other romantics who missell it. Really, it's through publications, mostly, and through the writing that he does. He's constantly writing. He is the worst model of the workload balance for an academic, I think. Morning, noon and night. Also speculating commercial ventures in America itself. But you're absolutely right that that notion of American republicanism is clearly put to the test and almost proven wrong, I think, with his own life experience. Yet he holds doggedly to it throughout his life. So it's interesting. I'm not sure he benefits terribly by it, but certainly the statistical history is enough to really keep him going, both financially and in terms of intellectual credibility for many years.
I just have a suspicion though he's kind of like an Irish American, or you see in bars in New York discussing her great
Yeah, quite possibly. But interestingly, doing that in Paris, which I think speaks volumes, really. The kind of intellectual activity that he partook in, he couldn't have done that in America, basically. Nobody was buying these kinds of books. And in fact, that one of the complaints that he often makes is that he can't get his work published in America. So it's the European market that's keen on this idea of the Republican experiment. I think particularly because they're going through a kind of conservative backlash with that Metternich era of history, where monarchies are being re-established And America's seen as almost the last bastion of republicanism at that point. So, but it's a good question, thank you.
Any further questions?
Does he write in French or English?
Yes, both. Yeah, and German. A little bit of Norwegian. Yes, but French is better than mine, which makes it a challenge to translate.
Sorry, could I just ask quickly the translation?
Yes.
10 translation. So where is that published?
That is published in Paris.
Right. In
Yeah.
English?
In English, yeah, and then sold in the United States. It's very, very difficult volume to track down. So, as with many of his, I'm very privileged to own the 3-volume statistical history in an original copy, which I paid way too much for, but it's beautiful hand-coloured maps.
Do you need to know the exact address to get these people, or can you just write like Warden, Paris?
It's usually the Ancien Consul, so that's enough to find him. And he lives in 2 addresses throughout his life. A couple of us in the room have actually been there to a kind of upper apartment in Saint-Germain. But yeah, you can. They know where to find him.
But generally, like all these networks of addresses, is it enough just... Because I'm kind of curious how we get like addresses and information.
It varies. If they use the postal system, the address needs to be more precise, but quite often these were carried by hand. So you have diplomatic dispatches, you can kind of smuggle your own personal stuff in there. And I reckon that's often how he built those networks. If he hadn't been a diplomat, I don't think any of this would have been possible. So he is kind of, well, it's a bit like fiddling your expenses, I suppose, in a way, but that's how he's doing it. Also, gentlemen would take other people's correspondence across the Atlantic and hand deliver it. So it's really a system of trust. But what you then find, of course, is that 6-9 months go by and something's gone missing in the post, and several other epistles have followed it. So tracking down the order in which these things happen is very, very difficult just by eye, and that's where the digital can come in and really help us to map that, because you kind of know when things are coming in large numbers. But if anyone knows of funding sources, I'd be very grateful as well.
Sorry, curious, is the surviving correspondence held mostly together somewhere?
Yeah, we're lucky. A lot of it's in the Library of Congress in Washington, and then Baltimore. It's kind of split. So it was quite clear that Baltimore wanted the American side of the correspondence, and the Library of Congress got all the French stuff. But there's also a few individual letters across various US archives. We've got some in Dublin, and one was in private hands, which I managed to buy on eBay. So God knows, it could be anywhere. I don't think we've got a descendant of the family here. I don't know if Jane knows if there's any in local being held by anyone.
I don't know of any local knowledge.
Yeah. So most of it is actually dispersed internationally. Yeah. But I don't want to find any more at this stage, to be honest. So.
All right. I think this conversation could go on a bit longer, but we are a wee bit pushed for time. So it's by pass now. We'll start up again at 1:15 with our panel discussion. But before we do, just want to say thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.